Welcome back to Tech City's Baranizzi, finally coming back to you guys today with a designer shirt for the FX-8320 versus the 4670k. Now, you guys want to know which is better for which, okay? So I've tested these extensively. I've done single-player benchmarks, multiplayer benchmarks, streaming benchmarks, video rendering, unzipping, and basically all the details and the test bench setups and the details for that are in the precursor video, so I'll put the link in the description below. Today I'm going to be analyzing all the results for you guys, telling you my thoughts, and then at the end of the video I'm going to be doing a power consumption calculation for you guys, and I'm going to be giving you guys the formula so you can calculate it for yourself, and then also I'm going to make some recommendations, because both these chips basically they have a point, they have a reason to exist, and you're probably wondering what's different. Why is your video any different than all the other Intel versus AMD videos out there? Well, my video is different because I hate both these companies. I hate them. I don't like Intel and I don't like AMD. So what you're going to get here is 100% objectivity. Now also, I have this time around, so compared to the other videos, we are testing a GTX 780 overclocked Lightning Edition. So, if any card is going to stress these CPUs, it's going to be this card. So I've custom overclocked it myself. I've set in a custom profile. It's as overclocked as this thing can go. So this thing is going to stress these CPUs, and if there's any results to be exposed, then this Lightning will expose them. Anyway, let's move on now first to the single player benchmarks. Okay, so let's move on now with the single player benchmarks. I'm going to be here down the bottom in the middle for you guys, guiding you through these benchmarks and talking about these numbers. And basically we had the 4670k clocked at 4.2 gigs versus the FX-8320 or 8350, pretty much the same thing, clocked at 4.4 gigs. So basically these are two overclocks that I consider obtainable by anyone in the overclocking community. I haven't heard of someone not being able to get their 4670k to 4.2, and I haven't heard of someone not being able to get their FX-83 20 or 50 to 4.4 gigs. So with that being said, let's move on to the first benchmark now, and this was Battlefield 4, which is an 8-threaded game. This was on single player on the test range, where the conditions were replicated pretty much precisely on both scenarios. So anyway, let's look here. We've got Battlefield 4 1080p Ultra, 2x MSAA with ambient occlusion off. This is what I like to play the game at, and we had it 153.2 on the average FPS for the Intel and 145.96. So there wasn't much between these two CPUs here. Really, both CPUs offered a pretty damn good experience. When we contrast that to 1440p, the numbers, the gap diminishes, and there's nothing between them at all. So if you want to play Battlefield single player, then it doesn't really matter if you have an AMD or an Intel CPU. However, let's move on now to Skyrim. At 1080p, we had ultra settings clocked in, no mods at all. This is just a plain vanilla. That's how I like to play Skyrim. I couldn't be bothered with mods, as I just clocked the game, and that's it. So let's move on now. The Intel scored 154.92 versus the AMD, which scored 109.12. So there was a significant difference between these two CPUs. Is it noticeable? This is the point. Are you going to notice these frame dips? Are you going to notice the frame difference? Actually, the answer is yes. The AMD did exhibit a slight bit of screen tearing, whereas otherwise the Intel did not exhibit any screen tearing at all. So that was something that I found really, that's the difference here. You can see the min dropped to 88 versus the minimum, which dropped to 124. If we contrast that to 1440p, we pretty much see the exact same results. Skyrim is a serious CPU bound game. It's ridiculous. You got pretty much the exact same results here at 1440p. So if you are a Skyrimmer with heavily modded Skyrim, you may get a benefit of using an Intel. Well, you definitely will get a benefit off using an Intel in that game. Moving on now to Bioshock Infinite at 1080p. So this was ultra, everything was maxed in this game, and it was a pretty game. We looked here, we had the first benchmark. It was just done on a level where everything could be replicated the same. I walked forward, I shot a gun off, and that was it. 25 seconds, and I did the same shooting, same sort of methodology every time. And what we saw here was an average of 131.84 frames per second versus 146.08. So the Intel did score a slightly higher average. However, this is the most important thing to note. There was a part in the level where the frame dipped, and I believe this was part of the level, must have been a CPU part of the level. As we see here, we got 70 on the minimum, and we have the AMD dropping down to 33, which is a significant difference. This is when the AMD started to exhibit some jittering and stuttering, as opposed to the Intel, which was relatively smooth throughout that benchmark at 1080p. When we contrast this to 1440p, we see a similar scenario with it dropping down to 33 frames per second. Again, the average frame rate dropped a little bit. This is a graphically intensive game, and we saw there 110 versus 100 flat. The Intel again dropped down to only 59 frames per second, so there was a difference here between the two CPUs, and I do believe the Intel won this because of the fact that it exhibited no stuttering or jittering whilst I was playing the game. We move now to Arma 3, so we got the 1080p on the right side this time. Anyway, Arma 3 was the game that exposed the biggest difference between the Intel CPU and the AMD CPU. And what I'm talking here was a huge difference. We're talking a 50%, on average, a 50% difference between these two frames. I'm pretty sure this is actually over 50%. We saw the average here, 46.04 frames per second versus 75.14 frames per second. There was a huge difference between these two CPUs, and it was noticeable. This was smooth, this was relatively smooth, this was a little bit choppy. One thing to note though, the minimums weren't too bad here, 44 and 70 on the Intel. So the Intel did score a big win here in a big way. When we contrast that to 1440p, that difference starts to diminish because the game does start to get GPU bound, and we saw the average drop to 68.24 versus 46.68. So you can see here that there's just a huge difference in Arma 3. So if you're an Arma 3 fan, and it was actually a pretty exciting game to play, then you will want to get an Intel CPU if you are on a high-end GPU, but I'll get onto that later in the recommendations. Moving on now to Crysis 3, a game that was real popular request from you guys. I believe this is an 8-threaded game as well. So anyway, we'll look at 1080p here on the right. We got here 47.16 frames per second on average from the AMD, but we look here at the Intel, it's scored 63 FPS on average. Now the biggest thing here was the minimum frame rate. Again, it dropped down to 10 frames per second, and this was actually one of the worst jitters I experienced out of all the benchmarking I did. I did have one in the streaming, but I'll get onto that later. This was dropped down to 10 frames per second, and it felt horrible. It happened the exact same time, both 3 times I did the benchmark, and it was when I was moving to shoot the guy, and yeah, it just really stuttered, and it was really noticeable. Now the Intel did score 32, so it did drop down to a little bit of a relatively choppy scenario, but it was a lot better than the FX-8320 at this stage. When we contrast that to 1440p, we had here an average frame rate of 41.8 versus 36.48. So that difference does start to diminish. Crysis 3 is a seriously graphically intensive game. However, that minimum frame rate, notice that minimum frame rate again dropped down to 11. In Intel, it maintained the 31 FPS. So there was a part in the level that must have had some sort of physics that the CPU couldn't cope with on the AMD. However, the Intel managed to cope with it relatively fine. When we move now to the last game, we had Batman Arkham Asylum. At 1080p, we had here the game scoring 120.16 average FPS on the AMD versus 157.88. Now this was everything max, 2 times MSA. Basically, in a nutshell, this game was absolutely fine on both CPUs. It did not make a difference at all. The AMD on 1440p closed the gap even further, and there wasn't much of a difference between these. Both these CPUs played Batman Arkham Asylum absolutely fine. So anyway, let's move on now to the multiplayer benchmarks. Alright, so now we're moving on to the multiplayer benchmarks, and basically this is going to have variance. It can't be helped. It's a multiplayer game where there's people standing in different places at all times, firing different guns, doing different things. So it's not going to be 100%. There's not going to be 100% accurate. There's going to be variance. However, I did try to eliminate as much variance as possible by trying to do the same pattern of things, firing the same guns, firing the same rocket at the same place, only driving cars and sticking to land. And this was done on a map called Langcam Dam, and the benchmark was done 3 times over 200 seconds. And if anything, I did try to make sure I was always firing a gun with the Intel. So if anything, I tried to stress the Intel as much as I could. However, the AMD did manage to score 90.48 at 1080p, and the Intel did manage to pull away a little bit with 113.535. The minimum frame rate was the most interesting here. We did have a 39 minimum frame rate, a drop to 39 FPS on the AMD, with the Intel sustaining 77. So I did notice this frame drop, and it was when I was firing a rocket. I did notice the jittering. The Intel didn't display any of that jittering at 1080p. When we move now to 1440p, the differences start to diminish, and we have here 78 versus 72. So the minimum frame rate again was similar to the 1080p result. So there was a part that was I think this frame drop was CPU due to the CPU. Again, it was when I was firing a rocket. The Intel managed to drop down to 51 here, which I do believe this frame drop may have been caused by the GPU. However, I think these results for Battlefield 4, especially if you're on an AMD graphics card, are going to be mitigated because they have released their Mantle update, which if you have an AMD graphics card, it helps out and it reduces the load on the CPU. So if you got an i9 290 and an AMD and you're playing and all you do is play Battlefield, then you don't have to really worry about these results. However, if you have an a NVIDIA graphics card, then you may wish to couple it and you're playing Battlefield 4, then you may wish to either sell your NVIDIA graphics card or get an Intel CPU if you're a diehard Battlefield Battlefield player who loves his Battlefield. Anyway, let's move now to Star Wars The Old Republic, a game that I'm currently playing through the campaign. It's actually a lot of fun. I am liking the campaign. I have heard different stories about the PvP, but anyway, let's move on to the results here. We had 80.32 at 1080p versus 106.92. It is important to note that this game does have a frame cap built into it at 112 frames per second. Now, this was just on a part of the map where I could run around and kill monsters and pretty much replicate this exact same results every time, and it was 58 versus 100 versus 95, the minimum frame rate. So I'm going to pay attention to the minimum frame rate because I did notice a little bit of screen tearing on the AMD as opposed to the Intel, which pretty much exhibited a smooth gaming experience. When we move on now to 1440p Ultra Max, the Intel did manage to maintain that smoothness. The AMD did manage to drop a little bit more with the frame rates falling to 66.24 versus the Intel, which maintained 105.36. So if we contrast that back to the 1080p, there wasn't really a difference between Star Wars between 1440p and 1080p on the Intel. However, the AMD did manage to drop quite a chunk there. So anyway, let's move on now to SC2, StarCraft 2. Now this is a game, surprisingly, everyone says, oh man, Intel beats the AMD at StarCraft 2. And I did find that it did beat it by a little bit. However, I found that both times, this was Ultra and everything was maxed, and I just played, what I did was I played Terran, and I just played a normal game where I was building Marines and I did build my siege tanks and I just attacked. And I found that both CPUs played this game absolutely fine. It was a smooth experience on both. Even though the Intel did beat it at 1080p, I thought there was just no difference here. Like in terms of playing the game, it was playing on both CPUs absolutely fine. Maybe if you get into a huge battle and you're one of those guys who always gets into huge battles, then the Intel might exhibit a bigger FPS boost, but 1440p, the differences were diminishing, and we had 105 versus 98.52. So both games played StarCraft 2 absolutely fine. That's all I'm going to say there. Heroes and New Earth, a game, this is my favorite game, and it's a MOBA game. So basically, you guys who played Dota will know Dota 2, and you guys who play League of Legends will know what MOBA games are. They're a lot of fun. I love it. Heroes and New Earth, I just love it. Even though it's a pretty imbalanced game, I enjoy playing it, and that's the main thing. You should enjoy playing your video games. What we had here was 91.59 at 1080p versus 122.358. Now, this game does have a frame limit built into the game at 125 frames per second. Both of these CPUs managed to hit that frame cap. However, the minimum frame rates, again, there was a big difference with 90 versus 50. So at one point, I played a character called Blitz, and I played in the exact same lane every time. So the results were pretty accurate here. The Intel did manage to not exhibit any jitter, as opposed to when it dropped down to 50 frames per second, it was a slight jitter. And that's the thing, even though it only shows 50 frames per second, the jittering, basically a frame would have stuttered, so it would have been actually lower than 50 FPS. If I did a frame latency test, it would show that as well. Anyway, we got here 1440p. We had here the difference started to pronounced. The difference here was, the difference was pretty much the same as it was at 1080p. We had 119 FPS versus 86 or 87, and we had the minimum of 49 versus 84. So that minimum frame rate was pretty much the same as it was at 1080p, which means I was doing something that was causing the CPU to jitter both times at 1080p and 1440p on the AMD. So let's move on now to the PlanetSide 2, which was a game that was requested a lot by you guys. Here we have the Intel exhibiting 133.6 frames per second versus the AMD, which exhibited 76.51 frames per second. So there's almost a 100. It's a significant difference in frames. So if you're playing PlanetSide 2, you will want an Intel CPU. I don't know why the difference is this big, but it's huge. And keep in mind, this was really a subtle benchmark. I didn't get into any battles. I just ran around the base firing a gun. It was just to see how the CPUs performed in this game, and you guys are getting a rough picture of how it performs. The Intel does pull away by a lot in this game. If we contrast that to 1080p, it looks like the AMD caught up a little bit, but it was still CPU bound. It's pretty much the exact same result, 76.51 versus 76.31, with pretty much the same minimum frame rate there. So it's the exact same minimum frame rate actually. The Intel did start to get GPU bound here, which was interesting, 105.29 versus 133.26. So anyway, the bottom line with this game is if you are playing PlanetSide 2, you'll most likely want an Intel CPU. So that was that part. Let's now move on to the streaming benchmarks. Okay, so basically these are the next benchmarks I did. I decided to test 2 games that I would personally be streaming in the future. I then decided that I was going to test them at 1440p and downscale it to 1080p with DxTory, and then send that through OBS to Twitch TV. I then decided to capture the frame rates with Fraps on top of that, and these are the results that I got. First up was Battlefield 4, which is an 8-threaded game, so if anything, this should have been in favor of the AMD. However, this is where things surprised me. The Intel scored an average of 64.54 frames per second, as opposed to the AMD, which scored 36.82, and look at these minimum dips. This went down to 9 FPS as opposed to the Intel, which only dipped to 56 frames per second. Basically, what one was streamable, the Intel was playable and was streamable. The AMD was just a horrid experience if you wanted to stream this on 8GB of RAM. Now, people are wondering why the AMD do so bad here. I believe it has to do with just that, the 8GB of RAM. I believe, as you guys know, the Intel does utilize memory better than the AMD does, so I believe this problem would be alleviated if I put in 16GB of RAM. So basically the lesson out of this was to, if you want to stream Battlefield 4 and you're on an AMD, have 16GB of RAM. Let's move on now to HON, where things were not memory, it wasn't bottlenecking. The memory was not bottlenecking, or something else was not bottlenecking these 2 games. The Intel managed to score 103.86 frames per second with a minimum of 72, so it was a very smooth experience on the Intel. The AMD dropped down to 57.34 frames per second with a minimum of 43 FPS. So the AMD was a little bit choppy as opposed to the Intel, which was a smooth experience for streaming Heroes of New Earth. Now, this, I don't know, basically in a nutshell, the Intel was better for streaming than the AMD was, so I don't know where people are telling me, look man, the AMD is better for streaming. I don't know where you guys are getting these rumors from, but the Intel clearly won here. And basically, if you guys want to stream and you're serious about streaming, I do recommend getting 16GB of RAM though. Okay, so let's look at some rendering and unzipping, and also a test with Unigine Valley that I did. First up, we have the Premiere Pro 6 rendering time, so lower is better here. Basically, I took a video and it was like a 3-minute video, I think, and it was basically, I just applied the same settings, the same Mbps rate on both, same audio on same 30 frames per second at 1080p, rendered it to MP4, and this was the results. The Intel at 4.2 GHz managed to do it in 2 minutes and 19 seconds. The AMD managed to do it in 3 minutes, pretty much 3 minutes flat. So the Intel was faster at rendering a video. Now let's have a look at the unzipping a file, and basically we had WinRAR. We unzipped an 8 GB file, which is pretty damn huge, and the Intel did it in 2 minutes and 15 seconds, and the AMD managed to do it in 3 minutes and 11 seconds. So on both these two real-world tasks that I do, for me personally, the AMD lost, the Intel won. So I don't know, a lot of people say rendering is faster on the 8-core. The 4-core beat it, so I'm a bit surprised there. When we move on now to Unigine Valley benchmark, this is one of the benchmark synthetics I like, because it's just a really graphically intensive benchmark, and it also tells you about power consumption as well. But we'll get on to power consumption next. We have here a score at 1080p of 4,221 on the Intel, and the AMD managed to score 3,176. However, when we contrast this to 1440p, we do see the difference diminish a lot, with the AMD scoring 2,461 and the Intel scoring 2,675. So that difference is really diminished at 1440p. I mean, if you went up to 4K as well, the differences would diminish as well, so practically be non-existent at 4K. Okay, so next up we have power consumption, and this is a sort of, it is pretty important in order to get to the correct recommendation, which CPU is best for you. We saw here with the idle difference, there really wasn't a lot in it. I think it was about 25 watts, so I did just check my power meter, and I did just round it to the nearest 5, just to make it simple when we're doing the calculations. So it idled at 135 versus 110 on the Intel, so there wasn't much difference there. I mean, the idling wasn't much of a difference there. However, when we looked at a game like Crysis 3, this is where things got heavy, and actually this was a really interesting thing for me too, because I've never seen my power supply push so hard before. The AMD managed to take it to 625 watts, and the Intel also managed to take it up to 570 watts. So there was a 55 watt power difference, and this surprisingly also scored a higher wattage than Unigine Valley did, which was pretty surprising for me. So Crysis 3, very intensive game. If anything, yeah, maybe it's something to be careful of, because if you have a weak power supply, this game may indeed crash your power supply. But it's a merit to the Antec EarthWatt 650 watt, because it handled these ample fine, so with then some. So anyway, we'll look at now the power consumption during Heroes of New Earth, and we saw here 265 versus 330, so there was about a 65 watt power difference here. And then we have the last was Battlefield 4 with about 575 watts versus 540, so there wasn't actually that much of a difference in Battlefield 4. So overall, I'd say there'd maybe be a 50 watt difference if you're gaming. The difference between these two CPUs, it wasn't that big. However, 50 watts is still 50 watts extra that you're going to pay. So again, I've done some quick calculations here, and basically this is the question you have to ask yourself. I put the formula in the description below. So if you live in a country where you're paying a lot per kilowatt hour, like I am, then put that price into the formula, put how many hours a day on average you use your computer or you're going to game, and then do the maths for yourself. Basically, I use probably about 4 hours a day, the computer. So I've done the maths here for me in Japan. The differences between these two CPUs for me would be about $25.55 a year. For you guys in Australia, if you're playing 4 hours a day, it'd be about $21.17. So if you're in the States, again, the States is really cheap, $8.76. You guys are paying, I think, like 12 cents a kilowatt hour on average. It's dirt cheap in the States. Power is pretty damn cheap. You know, I'm paying like 35 cents a kilowatt hour in Japan. I know the Aussies are paying about 29 cents. That's what my mum was paying when I went back at Christmas. And so you can see here that it depends where you live. Honestly, $8.76 is not that much. If you live in the States, I don't think power is going to be too big a concern. However, if you do live in a country where we're paying a lot per kilowatt hour, then this is something to think about. If you want to own this CPU for 2 or 3 years, then add that up. For me, it would be about a $50 difference, I'm guessing, over 2 years. So that's something to think about. Anyway, let's move on now to the final and the recommendations, where I'm going to talk about which CPU to recommend to you guys. and which, because they're both good in different scenarios, and I'm going to talk about that in the recommendations now. Okay, so you guys have made it this far to the recommendations, and basically the recommendation is going to be cut and dry. However, it's going to be similar to the precursor, except I'm going to talk about it more in depth today. And I'm going to talk about when's the best cases for which, when should you buy which, because they're both valid purchases. Let's talk about the FX-8320 first. Okay, so this is the 8-core, and also I'll talk about the FX-6300 as well, because these two CPUs represent great value at a certain level, and I'm going to talk about that level, and that is the mid-range level. I've recommended this thing in the past for $130. I've seen it go for $140. It's extraordinarily good value for money when you couple it with a budget AM3 plus 970 motherboard. It's a really good CPU. I mean, you're paying what, $60 for an AM3 plus motherboard, $130 for the CPU. You're getting a really good combo for $190. And you can then put that money towards a graphics card, say a GTX 760 or an R9 270, and you've got yourself one really good balanced gaming rig. So as you guys saw in the results though, when we start to go with the high-end graphics card, especially the GTX 780, I've then taken that graphics card, overclocked it more, and it's pushed these CPUs to the brink. And so when I pushed these CPUs to the brink, that's when the Intel started to pull ahead. And in some cases, it was a huge difference. I mean, you saw PlanetSide 2, that was like, what was it, 90% or something extra frames? That was just too big to say that it wasn't a difference. I mean, and so, you know, you guys are probably wondering, well, people have tested these things in the past and there was only like a 5 FPS difference. There wasn't much of a difference. But times have changed. I mean, the GTX 780's been released, the R9 290's been released, and you know, when these people did their tests, they tested it on what would be considered now mid-range graphics cards. So I think this update I think it's a necessary thing for the tech world and the tech community, and I'm glad I could do it for you guys because I want to end this debate. I'm sick of arguing Intel versus AMD. I'm blowing out of my mind here. Anyway. Okay, so let's move on now to the Intel. When is this the best buy? Basically, the Intel does definitely represent value for money when you're going with a high-end graphics card. As you guys saw in the tests here, this was done with the GTX 780 that I overclocked myself to the max it can go. And in some games, the differences were freaking huge. I mean, look at PlanetSide 2, that was a huge difference. Look at Arma 3. Arma 3 was a pretty damn fun game, by the way. Thanks for recommending me that. That was a really good game. I enjoyed that. So the differences in Arma 3 were big too. So basically, if you guys are going with a high-end graphics card, then get the Intel CPU. You're going to benefit. I think, honestly, this CPU does get underestimated a lot. If you guys didn't know, this currently has the best IPC on the market. It beats Intel's own 6 cores in single-threaded applications because it's got the best IPC. Their 4960X is only on the Ivy Bridge architecture. This is on the new Haswell architecture, which has better IPC than the 6-core. So I think this thing gets underestimated a lot, even because it's only a 4-core. Don't let that elude you. Most things don't even run on 4 cores at the moment. I mean, some games are running on 8 threads, but this thing on 4 threads will max any single GPU you can throw at it, as we saw in the results here. It's one hell of a CPU for the money. And I think it does get underestimated a lot. Everyone's like, get the 4770K. Don't worry about the 4770K. The 4670K is really good value for money. I mean, if you are streaming and you're serious about streaming and you do a lot of rendering, then the 4770K will be a good buy if it's going to save you a lot of time. But generally, the 4670K is a really good CPU when you couple it with a high-end graphics card. And that's my recommendations there. I'm going to talk about, so basically, let's cap that. FX-8320, great value for money when you couple it with a mid-range graphics card. This is great when you couple it with a mid to high-end graphics card, sort of like your GTX 770, your GTX 780, or your R9 280X, or your R9 290X. This is a great graphics card, great CPU to couple with a high-end graphics card. Let's talk about more things though. This is what I didn't mention in the benchmarks. I'm going to talk about a few other things as well. The Intel, I mean, there's the power difference as well. Sorry, I'll talk about that now quickly. Power difference. If you pay a lot for a kilowatt hour, go check your power bill. If you pay a lot for a kilowatt hour, then that's probably going to be another factor where you're going to want to consider the Intel over the AMD. As for me, for instance, it would probably amount to around, I don't know, maybe $50 over a few years. That's money that you're going to save if you get the Intel. If you live in the States, it's going to be so insignificant that you don't have to worry about it because you guys are paying 12 cents a kilowatt hour. So do the calculations for you. Do the calculations for you. I'm not sitting in your chair playing games for you. You're sitting, I'm sitting in my chair playing games for me. So I'm going to get what's best for me. And that's what I want you guys to get, what's best for you. These are my recommendations. This is what I'd recommend myself. What I'm recommending you guys today is what I'm recommending myself. And it's the same with my budget builds. This is what I would buy when I do my budget builds. So you get where I'm going. Anyway, let's talk about now. I want to lastly talk about different, some sort of augmented things that I didn't mention in the benchmarks. Okay, so why didn't you do frame latency testing? I decided to leave frame latency testing out because it was only going to show that the Intel was beating the AMD because of those minimum frame rates. I think that's proof enough there. The minimum frame rates already proved that the Intel had better frame latency than the AMD. Not to mention frame latency testing takes me a long time to compile. And I've already spent a huge amount of time doing these freaking tests. It's, yeah, like, I enjoy doing it though. I do enjoy doing it in hindsight. It's just I got a lot on my plate IRL. And, I'm a busy guy IRL, so design a shirt for the win. But, we go now. This is something I'm going to talk about with these CPUs. The Intel, and this is the reason why I put it back in my rig. After I finished the test on the AMD, I put the Intel back in because it was faster in general usage. And this is another thing as well I don't think a lot of people mention. The Intel loaded up, installed things quicker. It loaded up quicker. It loaded up games quicker. It alt-tabbed quicker. It changed freaking graphics settings quicker. It did every general usage thing quicker than the FX-8320 did. And I think that's something that doesn't get mentioned because I was so used to using my 4670k that when I went to my AMD, it frustrated me a little bit in some circumstances. So that's something as well to consider. You've got, a lot of threads, a lot of games aren't already... a lot of applications out there besides games aren't 8-threaded. A lot of applications are still only single or dual threaded. So you got to keep that in mind. The Intel's going to do better in all those applications besides gaming. You're probably wondering as well, with the FX-8320, it's an 8-core. Why didn't it do so well in the 8-threaded games? Well, it did well in the 8-threaded games. Sorry, I just dropped some sticky tape. It did well in the 8-threaded games. It's just that the Intel, even only on 4 threads, managed to max the graphics card. You've got 4 cores of CPU running against 1 core on a GPU. You got to keep that in mind. This thing on 4 threads maxed the GTX 780 amplifying. So that's something to not forget about. So I thought, in all, this is what it is, and that's the recommendations I made. I hope you guys enjoyed this whole series, and I'm going to get back onto my budget builds soon. They'll be coming next, and then I'm going to be getting onto some reviews. I got to get a lot of sound things to do, and yeah, that's about it. So okay, so that pretty much wraps it up. I hope you guys enjoyed this series of the FX-8320 versus the Intel. Honestly, I had a lot of fun building a new rig. I'm going to get you guys, do not worry, I'm going to get a lot of guides done for this. I'm going to talk about the tweaks. I'm going to talk about the different settings in the BIOS to tweak to get the best FPS out of this thing. I'm also going to do an overclocking tutorial for you guys on the AMD CPUs. And also, I'm going to be doing the review on the parts that I used on the AMD as well, because I've got a Zalman case there to review. I didn't use that for the AMD yet, but I'm going to be putting the AMD rig in that case. I've also got the big Zalman cooler to review, which I've got mixed opinions about. I mean, look, it's a great cooler. It works well. It's just the installation is one of the worst in the world anyway, but I'll give you guys a review on that soon. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's a long video, but if you're still here with me, then I love you guys a lot. So basically, I'm always going to keep giving you guys the truth. I don't give a shit about these companies and their sponsorship deals or whatnot. And that's ultimately because I care about you guys as individuals, and that's more important to me. Mummy and daddy raised me properly, and I got dignity and I got pride. I got a lot of it. I think too much at times. So and I'm comfortable. YouTube's not my living. I'm comfortable. I got an excellent job. Life's good, don't worry. Fuck yeah. Tech yeah city, baby. So if you haven't already, hit that sub button, and I'm going to be coming back with more tech videos for you guys because I love doing it. And hit that like button too, because this took me a long time to do. This is like one of the biggest missions I've done in my life. And did a lot of testing, pulled out a lot of hairs. It's a shame, you know, I'm surprised I'm not bald yet. But yeah, you know, this was fun. I'm going to build a new PC. I'll showcase the AMD PC for you guys, and I'll do a video on that too. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and peace out for now. And another thing, we got a new alias coming, baby. It ain't Brian Easy anymore. I mean, I've got to cure the tech world of fanboyism, so I'm now Dr. Easy. You guys can call me the Doc. I'm going to be cleansing the tech world of fanboyism, one fanboy at a time. Anyway, peace out for now. Dr. Easy, bye. Okay, so first up we had here Battlefield 4. Now this is probably one of the most requested games. Well, actually a lot of these games were requested a lot. That's why I did them all. But anyway, we had the i5-4670k Clay. 4670 cocked it. the i5-4670 Clay cocked at 4.2 gigahertz. Oh god. Welcome back to Tech Yes, it is Brian Easy coming back to you guys